Well, than I was 10 minutes ago. It's not advancing now. It's working.
This space is for the state in San Diego.
But I'm so happy to be here.
I'll send a child.
So huge thank you to Cliff for fixing everything. Well done. Thank you. And don't go away.
Don't give us the dates.
Huge and warm welcome to everyone here, and thank you so much for your patience. And if it wasn't for Cliff and Christiana, you know, we would not be ready to roll. So thank you all very much. And a very special welcome to Jill and Helen and David, wherever you are. I hope you're feeling better soon, and their extended family. And for those who don't know me, I'm Anna Cipriano, Pro-Vice Chancellor at Middlesex University, and I had the privilege and honour of working with Malcolm for over 25 years. Probably the longest serving boss he ever had. So that's my claim to fame. Yeah, exactly. We're gathered here this evening for the second in a series of labour law lectures. I deliberately used the word labour law because it was really important to Malcolm, celebrating the contribution, research and legacy of Professor Malcolm Sargeant. And as part of his lasting legacy, his family have set up the Professor Malcolm Sargeant Charitable Trust in his memory to financially support a new Middlesex student. And before I introduce our speaker, Professor Susan Bisom-Rapp, I would like to invite Helen to say a few words about the Charitable Trust and to actually introduce you to the first recipient.
Thank you, everybody. I'm one of the trustees of the Professor Malcolm Sargeant Charitable Trusts, and I feel very honoured to be one of the trustees. Thank you to Middlesex for organising this lecture, and thank you to Susan. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. I just thought it'd be useful. I just thought I'd set out a bit of why we set it up. Because when my dad died, we were very keen to do something in his name. And I think as a child, you don't want your dad to be forgotten. And maybe it was because of the horribles of COVID lockdown we were in, not being able to be close to loved ones. The working on setting up a charity was a ray of sunshine in those bleak times. So that's a bit about the background. My dad was who he was because of his university education. It defined him and he loved learning. It hadn't been easy as he was the first in his family to go to university. He'd always encouraged people to study for a degree, and it seemed an obvious choice, therefore, to set up a charity that helped those studying. We, of course, chose Middlesex, as this was a place where he worked and where he became the prolific writer that he was, and had many happy years here. So we've set up this charity to provide a scholarship to a university student at Middlesex, who, and some of our key criteria is they're first in their generation to attend university and in need of financial support. And it's advertised through Middlesex University, and special thanks to everyone here for helping make this possible. We've had a great first year or so, where we've had some key donations and had an amazing friend who's run a marathon for us, and so thank you to her, but especially and loads of sponsorship for that, which is amazing. And it's enabled this charity to award its first scholarship this year. So, and we're delighted to have Noor, who's here, and we're delighted that it is Noor because having met her, found out what a completely wonderful person she is, and we're very happy that we've managed to successfully get this first scholarship and get it up and running. And we've also just been recognised by the Charity Commission, so we're now official, which is very exciting, which means we get gift aid, which brings me on to the next very important thing, because obviously we'd like to continue with this scholarship, and it's obviously all dependent on funding. It's obviously incredibly important in these times. I mean, you know, there's lots of things my dad would definitely be saying about the times that we live in, but I think in some small part we want to do something, and something in his name that he'd feel so very strongly about. So we will want to continue fund this scholarship, and so we'll be doing some fundraising in the next year or so. So if anybody is willing to donate, but we will be sending out an email. If you can sign up, I've got a little list outside. If you can put your name and email address, just for us to contact you in future, because we're just sort of setting up our sort of fundraising ideas and anything that we do, and any contribution is incredibly important, and we'll be very grateful, so we can continue this in his name. So thank you very much.
I'm going to deeply embarrass you now. Can you just stand up so that everyone can see who you are? Because when we have a few questions at the end, people want to ask, and we're absolutely delighted that you are the first recipient of Professor Malcolm Sargeant Award. Okay, now on to the bit I was supposed to be doing, which is to introduce our eminent speaker tonight. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Susan Bisom-Rapp, Professor of Law and Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at the California Western School of Law. And welcome to Charles as well. Thank you for bringing her along, Charles. Susan is an internationally renowned scholar in the field of international and comparative workplace law, who writes about globalization, equal employment opportunity, occupational safety and health, and the gig economy. So I don't think there's anyone in this room that Susan has missed out in terms of her in her endeavours. She's an author and co-author of numerous articles and books, and one of her recent books, Lifetime Disadvantage, Discrimination and the Gendered Workforce, was co-authored with Malcolm, and that's really special in terms of the place that Susan has in this particular event. Her published work has twice been selected as among the best articles on women's legal rights, and was the recipient of the National 2019 Paul Stephen Miller Memorial Award for outstanding academic and public contributions to the field of labour and employment law scholarship. An elected member of the American Law Institute since 2007 and a fellow of the American Bar Foundation since 2018, Susan serves on the academic advisory board of the Doctoral Research School in Labour Development and Innovation at the Marco Biaggi Foundation, University of Modena and Reggio Emilia in Italy. She also serves on the editorial board of the Employee Rights and Employment Policy Journal, was the 2021 chair of the Association of American Law Schools section on women in legal education, and has served as the section's chair-elect, secretary, treasurer, and on its executive committee. So I think we're absolutely delighted that Susan has got time to be here tonight. So prior to her academic career, Susan practiced workplace law in New York City at Strook and Lavin, and perhaps most important of all, she is a dear friend to Jill and to Malcolm. I now call upon Professor Susan Bisom-Rapp to deliver the Professor Malcolm Sargeant Memorial Lecture entitled Older Women Workers and the Pandemic. And I can just see Malcolm looking down and smiling. Thank you.
Very well, we'll get this on. Thank you very much, Anna. It is a pleasure to be here. I tuned in last summer to the webinar version of the first Malcolm Sargeant Memorial Lecture in Employment Law given by the eminent Professor David Lewis. He did a fantastic job looking at 50 years of labor and employment law and how it's developed over time. I think of Professor Lewis as providing the macro view. And what I'm going to do is provide a micro view, kind of a deep view. This is a project, Older Women Workers and the Pandemic, that Malcolm and I wanted to work on and complete together. The pandemic began, to remind everyone, as if you need reminding, in March of 2020. And Malcolm said, oh, we need to write about what's happening with older women workers. And we had big plans, but we found there wasn't enough research. And I think he was feeling tired, and he said to me, I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And I said, well, eventually I will. If we fast forward to the fall of 2021, I think I was invited by Professor Sue Westwood of York University to contribute a chapter to a book. And she said, I know you've lost your distinguished co-author, Malcolm Sargeant, but would you write a chapter for us on older women workers in the pandemic? And I hope that you don't find my invitation insensitive. And I said, insensitive? Not at all. I would be honored to actually pick up and work on and complete a project that Malcolm and I had fully intended to do together. So thank you for the invitation. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, older women workers and the pandemic. It is just an honor to be commemorating one of my closest friends. It is it was an academic partnership that was so much more than that. It's quite rare that you co-author with someone, end up becoming incredibly close friends, fall in love with their family, with their children, and in the case of Malcolm and Jill, their grandchildren as well, and spend a lot of time, speaking at conferences together. And I felt his loss quite keenly. Like many people in the room, I miss him terribly. But I will say one of the good things about being an academic is that you publish and your words live on. And so I can read Malcolm's writing and I still hear his voice. I hear his voice dispensing sage career advice and personal advice with a twinkle in his eye. And he often helps me through thinking about a fine point of scholarly work that I am doing. So he's very much still part of my life. Now, although I attended many scholarly meetings with Malcolm on 3 different continents, no less, my fondest memory of Malcolm was a tour that he and Jill gave my family of his spectacular allotment, which was not far from this campus, this wonderful Middlesex University London campus. My husband Charles and our youngest son Ezra have incredible memories of Malcolm, and I'm going to advance it. Please advance. I'm going to have to go up there and advance it myself.
Towards the laptop.
Pointed towards the laptop. It's still not advancing. What if we try an arrow? It was working and then it wasn't. Yep. Try that. I'm very good at improvisation, so don't worry. We'll figure this out. Well, I don't have slides now. Slides I spent hours working on. Nope, still not advancing.
I want you all to start imagining green things.
Yeah, this lovely photograph of the allotment. See if we can pick that up again. Share the screen, share.
There it is.
That's just an incredible picture that captures the tour of the allotment. And so I've got these incredible memories of Malcolm amongst the lettuces and the potatoes and the strawberries, and he even grew artichokes, which I thought was just amazing. He tended to his fruits and his vegetables the way he tended to his students, some of you who are here, with patience and love and persistence, and everyone in his orbit flourished. I like to think of the allotment as a metaphor for Malcolm's relationship to those lives that he touched. So we met in 2008 at a conference in Modena, Italy, and we became fast friends. During our 12-year friendship and our scholarly partnership, Malcolm and I published 8 works together. It was one book, several book chapters, and the rest were journal articles. I'm going to give a plug for our book, just to make sure that we keep sales going. Our book was published in 2016. It's called Lifetime Disadvantage, Discrimination, and the Gendered Workforce, and was published by Cambridge University Press. Now, we were both law professors, and I still am, with expertise in employment law. We shared a very special interest in equal employment opportunity law, protections for older workers, and looking at how the law empowers or fails to empower an aging labor force. As we noted in the preface to our book, what made our collaboration so rich was that we were teaching and writing on both sides of the Atlantic. Malcolm spent his career at Middlesex University, London, of course, and I spent my career in California, first at Thomas Jefferson School of Law for 25 years, and then more recently I moved laterally to California Western School of Law, both schools in San Diego. Beginning with our first published work, which examined the plight of older workers during the 2008 global economic crisis, Malcolm and I was struck by 2 things. First, we were struck by divergences in employment law and social protection in the UK and the US. UK law was far more protective of workers than is US law. And that really wasn't surprising because when we began our collaboration, the UK was still a member state of the European Union, and particularly in the area of age discrimination, European law was having a tremendous impact in the United Kingdom. Equally notable, though, were convergences in outcomes on the ground. So figuring out how and why we had different legal regimes and yet similar and often adverse outcomes for older workers was a through line of our work together. Why does the law look so different on the books, but the law on the ground, the way it functions for individuals, for human beings, the effects seem to be the same. So understanding the complexity of why employment law in the UK and the US fell short of the mark in protecting older workers required us to understand that older workers are not a homogeneous group. Their conditions are influenced and differentiated by race and by ethnicity and by gender and sexual orientation and gender identity and religion and immigration status and socioeconomic status and educational attainment, whether or not they're disabled, and whether they have caring responsibilities and other characteristics as well. Moreover, one's position in retirement, for example, is often dependent upon the context in which one's career or work life took shape over many decades. So we turned our attention to older women workers as a way to illustrate these points. Now, as promised, the title of the lecture is Older Women Workers and the Pandemic, and I'm going to frame that topic in terms of a model that Malcolm and I developed in a 2014 Law Review article and subsequently built out in our book, Lifetime Disadvantage, Discrimination, and the Gendered Workforce. The model assists in understanding the position of older women workers in the labor market prior to the pandemic, which began really, I guess the WHO declared that we had a pandemic. It was March 11th, our son's birthday. It was March 11th, 2020. Prior to this, you will get an understanding by delving into the model that Malcolm and I developed. After that, I'm going to position the pandemic within the literature of disasters. Then I'm going to discuss pandemic effects on older women workers in 2 countries, Malcolm's country, the United Kingdom, and my country, the United States. And then I'm going to opine a bit about whether equal employment opportunity law, specifically protections against age discrimination, is an effective tool for countering the complex intersectional bias that some older women workers may face. So that's the outline. Prior to the pandemic, Malcolm and I wrote about the global problem of gendered ageism in employment and women's significantly greater risk of poverty in retirement. The global population is aging at a staggering rate, more in some countries than others, but globally, the population is aging. And the majority of the aging population, and the most aged of the global population, is female. Moreover, internationally, women who on average outlive men experience poorer economic outcomes in later life than their male counterparts. It's a global problem. As we explore the complex reasons for older women's shortfalls in economic security, we covered ground very similar to that of social gerontologists who theorize about aging and cumulative disadvantage. As explained by Professor Dale Danifer, the theory of cumulative advantage and disadvantage posits that individual initial endowments or deficits of resources and status and opportunity will produce inter-individual divergence, which increases over time. Very simply, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Start with those individual endowments, trace them out over the decades, and you will see increasing divergence. Of significance to social gerontologists, these divergences over the life course become increasingly pronounced, and they can be observed in, for example, educational attainment, earnings trajectories, health outcomes, and pension status. Disparate outcomes due to cumulative disadvantage are especially evident when assessing the challenges of aging for women in comparison to men. Sociologist Nanette Davis describes a cycle of discrimination and disadvantage for women that begins with a different kind of education, is impacted by marriage, is adversely impacted by caring responsibilities for children, partners, and later elderly parents, structured by occupational segregation. Women go into particular occupations, they dominate in some, characterized by lower pay, amplified by more frequent than men, exit from and re-entry into the labor market, and concluding with degraded retirement income. But in addition to being influenced by social gerontologists, Malcolm and I were influenced by the work of legal academics theorizing about intersectionality. American legal scholar, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who teaches at Columbia Law School and also UCLA Law School, first used the term intersectionality to signify the unique way in which Black women experience discrimination, which really cannot be understood fully by looking separately at the characteristics of race and gender. The discrimination they experience is far different than that of white women, for example, and it's far different than that of Black men. And so you have to use an intersectional lens to understand their experiences. So the theorizing around intersectionality began with race, and it has spread more broadly to other characteristics. Recently, scholars have noted the need for intersectional analysis in the field of gerontology because there is no average older person. They are very different from one another, as well as greater attention to aging among those working with the intersexual literature, because when you look at intersectional literature, sometimes they act as if everybody is either young or middle-aged, and they never get any older. So Malcolm and I tried to bridge that gap by bringing intersectionality into our consideration of women's poverty, greater poverty in retirement than men. A guiding principle for us both, was that older women workers can suffer discrimination at the confluence of age and gender. In other words, bias can manifest itself against them based upon being female and middle or older aged. Additional statuses, including race, ethnicity, sexual minority status, may further complicate discrimination against or the disadvantage of older women. We felt it was really important to make visible the complex, potentially intersecting characteristics of women as they age. And so we came up with a model. We began working it on 2013. I was on sabbatical, and I spent a week in the home of Malcolm and Jill talking about what the model would look like. Here it is. It's our model of lifetime disadvantage, and it set forth the major factors that account for unequal outcomes experienced by older women workers at the end of their careers. And what we found is, to understand what happens to women over the life course, you need to go back to what happens to them in girlhood. You don't understand the end unless you understand the beginning and the middle as well. And so we came up with 10 factors that are grouped into two categories. The first category covers what we call the gender-based factors. Those include education and training, the fields that women choose to study and men choose to study, and they do differ. And they don't only differ in the UK and the United States, but they differ in many countries. And then, in addition to education and training, we looked at stereotyping, intersectionality discrimination, caregiving roles, and career outcomes. And that really meant that we were looking at the problem of maternal walls, putting an end to careers, and glass ceilings as well. Then after the gender-based factors, our book talks about the incremental factors, and the incremental disadvantage factors are those that accumulate over time. Women fall further and further behind their male counterparts. And so those factors were pay inequality, occupational segregation, non-standard working, especially the prevalence of women in part-time work compared with men, career breaks. Women have frequent exits off of and entrances into the labor market with, in fact, wage penalties upon their return, and then retirement and pensions. Now, our model broke new ground by setting the factors out and taking that kind of meta view of women's lives, but it also broke new ground because for each of the 10 factors, we took a look at UK law and policy that is relevant to them, and no one had done that before. Our analysis revealed a disjointed incremental legal and policy approach in both countries that fell short of the mark at every step. Correspondingly, because law and policy were falling short, many women over time were falling further and further behind, hence the very big gaps in economic security that we see when women enter retirement. Working women simply accumulate less of the financial resources necessary for resilience when they face emergencies, and they have less resources that are necessary to sustain them in a dignified retirement. In short, we argued that the failure of law and policy to prevent gender-based cumulative disadvantage leads to degraded outcomes for retired women. So that was before the pandemic. That takes you up to March 11th, 2020. With that foregoing as a background, let's think about the pandemic. As outlined in our model, older women suffer gender-based disadvantage in ordinary times. Given this, one would expect that they will suffer even more greatly during disasters. And in fact, there's a very rich disaster literature that Malcolm was familiar with and he thought was fascinating. And when I began writing this chapter in 2021, I had occasion to delve into it as well. Disaster scholars have produced a literature that details the way society's most vulnerable, women and many in the older population, suffer disproportionately during disasters. And in this view, hazards, which could be hurricanes or earthquakes, if you're thinking about Turkey recently, or pandemics, They become disasters in part due to socioeconomic processes and policies. And the processes and policies fail to prepare vulnerable groups to be able to mitigate their hardships or to be able to rebound quickly from the hazards they confront. The COVID-19 pandemic provides an opportunity to assess whether the UK and the US governments adequately planned for disasters with their most vulnerable communities in mind. In a soon-to-be published book chapter that I began writing in 2021, after Malcolm passed, I considered the impact of the pandemic on older women workers. And I assessed the utility of equal employment opportunity law in confronting gendered ageism, which in fact surged during the pandemic. Several of the model's factors assist in assessing the impact of COVID-19 and its crisis on older female workers. And these include occupational segregation, intersectionality, discrimination, stereotyping, and caregiving roles. To begin with, occupational segregation by gender, as I mentioned, is common in many countries, including the UK and the US. The occupations where women predominate are characterized by lower pay, lower power, and lower prestige. Intersectionality is evident in the labor market as well, and race and ethnicity complicate the gender segregated occupational landscape. In terms of COVID-19, women, especially racial and ethnic minority women, were overrepresented in many of the industries and occupations on the front line of the pandemic response. Age is also an intersectional complicating factor here. For example, 1/3 of American frontline workers during the height of the pandemic were aged 50 or over. Frontline jobs, however, were not necessarily secure jobs. Moreover, the occupational sectors employing the greatest percentage of women, especially women of color, for example, leisure and hospitality, retail other than grocery stores, personal services, healthcare, childcare, social services, and education, were those where many jobs were lost during the first economic shocks of the pandemic. So let's turn to the US, my home country first. The dislocations were very significant in the US, and some of the numbers will shock you. Unemployment peaked for American women who were 55 plus in April 2020 in the United States at 15.4%. 15.4%. Unbelievable. We had come out of a period where unemployment in the United States was 3%. So for older women, 55 plus, it rockets to 15.4. Taking a look at the 65 plus category of American women, the April 2020 unemployment rate was 16.85%, almost 17%. Compared with the Great Recession of 2008, American women ages 55 to 64 saw a much greater drop in employment due to the pandemic. More specifically, between 2019 and 2020, their employment rate dropped by 3 percentage points compared to only 0.7 percentage points between 2007 and 2011. Something very different was happening to women workers, older women workers, in the pandemic. An American Association of Retired Persons, known as AARP study of mid-career and older women workers found significant pandemic-related impacts. AARP's June 2020 survey of American women 40 to 65 found that 41% lost income due to job loss, reduced hours, furlough, temporary layoff, and reduced wages. And of concern was that the problem was much worse for older Black women, who in fact suffered these adverse effects at 20%. They lost income due to job loss, reduced hours, furlough, temporary layoff, and reduced wages. 20% of older Black women, 23% of older Latinas who are working. If you compare that to the white population, still bad numbers, but not anywhere near as bad. Older white women had these adverse economic effects at 13% and Asian women by only 14%. The economic fallout suffered by older women workers was produced by the US's very strange COVID-19 labor market policy, which retained its anomalous flexibility in employment dismissal law. It is very easy to sack people. It is very easy to get rid of workers in the United States. So to counter the effects of mass job loss, the US government during the height of the pandemic provided generous unemployment subsidies to people who lost jobs on top of what they were normally entitled to. The government also issued economic stimulus checks regardless of labor market status during the beginning of the pandemic. So there was a lot of money that was sloshing around, certainly. An ILO study noted that this actually accelerated the process of shedding workers in the United States, because employers thought, well, if we get rid of these people, the government will just take care of them. So why not sever the employment relationship? And they did. And of course, it followed the patterns that Malcolm and I explored before the pandemic, really catastrophic for older women workers, especially those of color. So while many American workers lost work and the US economy rebounded relatively quickly, job loss is especially punishing for older workers, men and women, who are more likely to face difficulty in re-entering paid employment. And this difficulty is tied to another of the factors in our model of lifetime disadvantage, and that factor is stereotyping. Pernicious stereotypes about the abilities of older workers are prevalent. Indeed, mid-career and older American women report that age discrimination, not gender discrimination, is their largest obstacle to finding new employment. Oops, oh no, it's still slide 5. Yeah, there we go. A final impact of the pandemic on American older women workers involved increased responsibility for caring. And here, a lot of people who work in women's studies, when they think about caring responsibility, tend to think of younger women who have responsibility, or sort of middle-aged women who have responsibility for school-aged children. But in fact, during the pandemic in the United States, and certainly in the UK as well, many grandmothers stepped in and were helping with caring as well. The American Association of Retired Persons survey found, in fact, that those with caring responsibilities, those older women workers, lost jobs at a greater rate than those who were unburdened by caring. So the caring responsibilities increased, and so did the heightened job loss and decreases in hours worked. So in terms of pandemic caring burdens, the survey, there we are, the survey revealed that during the pandemic, fully 43% of women aged 40 to 65 shouldered additional care responsibilities, either for an adult, many people were caring for adults, aging parents, for example, older partners, or for a child or a grandchild. So 43% of American women who are 40 to 65 have these additional responsibilities. Moreover, intersectional effects based on race and ethnicity were evident, with Hispanic and Black older women being much more heavily burdened with care responsibilities than white or Asian older women. And you can see the bar graph below that, in fact, it is Hispanic women, 52% of them had caring burdens, additional burdens for caring, as compared with 34% of Asian women. So we see that intersectionality effect there as well. So what about women in the country? Older women in the UK who worked suffered similar harms to their American counterparts, despite the UK government responding to the pandemic with very different labor market policies. In the UK, as you know, the government provided subsidies to employers to retain their workers. More specifically, the UK's coronavirus job retention scheme provided to employers payments of 80% of the wages of furloughed workers, up to £2,500 per month. Under this policy, rather than seeing a catastrophic rise in unemployment, which you saw in the United States, the UK labor market during this period in which the scheme was in effect evidenced a drop in average hours worked. In other words, employment relationships were maintained even though many people were at home and they were idle. So in the US, we saw severed employment relationships, not so in the UK. Even so, the impact across the labor force was not equal. Older workers in the UK were more likely than their mid-career cohorts to be furloughed under the coronavirus job retention scheme. You'll note younger workers also. And in fact, the resolution Foundation report noted it was a U-shaped crisis with the biggest impacts falling on the young and the old in terms of the labor market. And those in the middle, bad, but not quite so bad. In fact, by July 2020, 27% of 55 to 64-year-olds in the UK were on furlough, as were 35% of those workers aged 65 and above. By January 2020, a notable portion of older workers who were employed the year prior were either no longer working or furloughed or had sustained a drop in earnings of at least 10%. For those aged 55 to 59, 27% had suffered those adverse economic impacts. For those aged 60 to 65, 35% were impacted in this way. Now, one recent UK study noted that age can help predict which workers will suffer adverse employment outcomes, with very young workers and very old workers suffering the worst. But it also noted that even more important in predictive accuracy in figuring out who's going to suffer the worst effects was occupational sector. You need to look at the industry in which the person was working and the type of employment contract and the wage scale. Lower wage workers were more likely to suffer adverse employment consequences. So older workers in the UK were more likely to experience furlough, lost pay, or become economically inactive if they were working in a shutdown sector, hospitality, non-supermarket retail, and leisure, if they were low paid, if they were self-employed or employed on an atypical contract type. So that study found, though, a large adverse economic effect for older Black or minority ethnic workers. So there's the intersectionality in the UK. By January 2021, 36% of older Black or minority ethnic workers aged 50 to 65 had been furloughed, 36%, or had exited the labor market, or had lost pay, compared with only 26% of white older workers. So you see intersectionality again, 36% of Black and minority older workers, only 26% of white older workers. Still terrible numbers for all older workers, but intersectional effects. So the Office of National Statistics did a labor force study that is also relevant. ONS found particularly large effects for older Black women with their unemployment rate more than doubling between the years 2019 to 2020. So for older Black women, the unemployment rate in the UK jumped from 3% to 7.6%. For older white women, it barely budged between 2019 and 2020. In 2019, the unemployment rate for older white women was 1.6%. And during the pandemic, it went up to 1.9%. So again, intersectional effects. Now, many wondered what would happen to the furloughed workers at the close of the retention scheme, which ended September 30th, 2021. A recent UK House of Commons paper reported that older workers were among the most likely to become economically inactive during the pandemic. Reinforcing this report is a Resolution Foundation study, which found that older workers, especially those who were women, were more likely to leave the labor force entirely than in previous crises. a full 14% of women aged 55 to 65 who were working at the start of the pandemic by October 2021 were either unemployed or economically inactive. So that's 14%. Comparing them to men in that age group, only 10%. Still big numbers, but the women were suffering the fuller effects. Now, this is concerning because, as in the US, older workers in the UK experience greater difficulty in finding new work when they lose a job, often due to age discrimination, and even in good economic times are more likely after losing employment to become economically inactive. The increase in older workers exiting the UK labor market prior to state pension age has been significant, and it reverses the pre-pandemic trend of people extending their working lives. This new pandemic era trend is especially acute for older Black or minority ethnic workers aged 50 to 65, who are more likely than white workers to be forced from their jobs. As in the US, caring responsibilities for Black and minority ethnic women play a role in economic inactivity compared to white workers. Older BME workers in the UK who exited during the pandemic are more than twice as likely to be unable to work because of their caring responsibilities. Putting this in terms of all older women versus all older men, women in the UK ages 50 to 65 who have left the labor market are more than twice as likely to have become inactive due to caring responsibilities as compared with men. So, COVID-19 has clearly magnified gendered ageism in the workplace. There are a number of surveys that have demonstrated this unfortunate effect. And in fact, ageism tends to skyrocket in bad economic times. During a pandemic, it was all the more so. Can we rely on the Equal Employment Opportunity Law as our corrective? Now, both the US and the UK prohibit employment discrimination based on age. Regarding the impact of the law, a few studies that have examined the legal prohibition of age discrimination do identify some small positive effects in employment and society for the people who are protected by the law. So certainly we do not want to get rid of Equal Employment Opportunity Law. Before the pandemic, however, Malcolm and my model of lifetime disadvantage demonstrated that Equal Employment Opportunity Law did a poor job of preventing cumulative intersectional gendered ageism. Significant difficulties remain in over-reliance on Equal Employment Opportunity Law to solve the problems of older women workers of varied social position and background, especially in the wake of a global pandemic. And these include some weaknesses in the law on the books when it comes to the prohibition of age discrimination in both the UK and the US, topic Malcolm and I wrote about before the pandemic, difficulties of pleading and proving intersectional age discrimination claims, the emotional and financial costs on discrimination claimants, and the fact that employer aversion to hiring older workers is chronic and intractable. The challenges that are associated with deploying the law make it clear that policy interventions are necessary to address the pandemic-related cumulative harms that are suffered by older women workers. National policy prescriptions can be aided by precepts that are embedded in international law and the recommendations of international experts. There was a recent report published by Claudia Mahler, the UN's independent expert on the employment of all human rights by older persons. And her report found that COVID-19 globally magnified discrimination against older women and simultaneously highlighted the extent to which law and policy renders them invisible. Older women themselves are rarely consulted in creating or implementing relevant strategies. Cumulatively, older women face hiring discrimination, greater care obligations than men, lower labor market participation, and pay and pension gaps. The UN report exhorted countries to mainstream a gender perspective into all of their policies and action plans related to aging and preparing for future pandemics. It suggested that we combat gendered ageism. We need to collect granular relevant data. We need to design programs to ensure that older women gain access to well-paid work and receive credit for unpaid care work towards economic benefits. And the report also said that additional gender-sensitive pension reform is necessary. In short, the independent expert called for a paradigm shift in planning for older women's needs during disasters and during ordinary times. And that's certainly the kind of message that Malcolm and I were broadcasting before the pandemic. As we noted at the end of our book, the US and the UK require a more holistic approach to eliminating intersectional gender discrimination and disadvantage, an approach that acknowledges but transcends gender and leads to a reconfigured and more humane workplace and a dignified retirement for all. Now, I don't want to end here because it's too negative. It's really too negative. So I was sitting in Jill's house today and I thought, you just need to say something positive because there's some really interesting research that I'm going to tell you about, and it was done here in the UK. Now, it's true that law and policy have fallen short of protecting older women workers in the pandemic, but I want everyone in the room to remember that the members of vulnerable groups are often not helpless in the face of adversity. I'll say it again, they are not helpless in the face of adversity. In fact, there's been fascinating research done by Professor Sue Westwood of York University and her colleagues about what happened during the UK's COVID lockdown to older lesbians. So study of how they fared in the UK during the lockdown. And the research team out of York University found that yes, the virus was a magnifier, but it was a strange magnifier for older lesbians. It magnified the unhappiness of those who were unhappy, but it also magnified the positive, strong social supports of those who had robust networks. Those with the strong support networks actually thrived during lockdown in the UK, despite the fact that older women workers faced serious harms. Those who were socially isolated, however, faced greater physical and mental effects. But the idea that strong community support can prevail even where law and policy fall short, to me, is heartening indeed. So I'm going to end on that positive note, and thank you very much for listening. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I completed the project that Malcolm and I were supposed to be working on together. Yes.
Right, we have a few, just a huge thank you to Cindy for fascinating. And you know, I can see Malcolm throughout the work, and you know, his sparkling eye and the fascination that he would have had with, you know, all things that were unfair, right? So definitely. We've got a few minutes before we depart to have a few refreshments for some questions. So since we've got Susan here as a captive audience, so any questions that you'd like to? Gentlemen here.
So, I'm sure you're aware that in England, I think in the States, there's a big issue about what's happened, why people aren't returning to the workforce and the missing people. So I was trying to correlate what you were doing with that issue, not very successfully, because there's so many factors. There's so many factors.
Do that.
So, what would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I would like to comment on that. Same trend in the United States. There are many people who are economically inactive and we're having difficulty attracting them back. In fact, right now, it's a wonderful market if you're looking for a job in the United States for most workers. I think there are different reasons why people are not coming back. Some groups may have sufficient pension income if you became economically inactive during the pandemic and you had sufficient pension income or other investment income. You might not want to return. Indeed, you might be worried about future permutations of the virus and why expose yourself to that in any way. You're having fun now in your retirement. For women, it's a more complicated position, I think, because women are more likely to have caring responsibilities than men. Some of them can't come back because they're helping daughters with the care for grandchildren. Some people have had COVID and they have long COVID. I have friends who are working and they are, they were very healthy people in their late 30s and 40s, and now they have long COVID. And they're teaching at university level, and all they can do is get through the lectures, and then they go home and they fall on the bed and they can't move. So we have to take into account that we have an epidemic of long COVID. After you've gotten through with the acute infection, many people are still ailing a year, maybe more, after having had the infection. So that's a reason as well. I think some people have gone back for additional schooling. They're changing careers. Some people in the middle are choosing to have children, and they are finding in the United States that the support for child rearing is insufficient. The support for childcare is non-existent, it's too expensive. So women in the middle are staying home if they don't have a grandma or grandpa to help out on the home front. So I think the reasons are really varied. What's very interesting is talking to my law students now. They're Generation Z, no more millennials, a few millennials, mostly Gen Z. People in Gen Z are very picky about the work that they want to take, very picky. A lot of people want to work remotely. Employers want them back in the office. There is tension, right? We're going through that on my own campus. The students, some of them thrived in a virtual world. Some of them fell apart and needed brick and mortar classrooms. Many professors say, I'm the vice dean currently, I'm in charge of the course scheduling. Many of my colleagues are asking if they can work remotely. Can I teach all my courses on Zoom? And the answer is no, because our classes are supposed to be mostly in person. And if you teach on Zoom, then you don't have those kind of conversations when you just meet up with someone in the hallway after class, or your professor says, let's go for coffee. That doesn't happen on Zoom. And so there's this problem with getting people to come out of their flats and then their houses and come back into the workplace as well. So I think it's a really complicated problem. And we're experiencing the same thing you're experiencing in the UK. And now with the bank failures in the Silicon Valley, who knows what we're going to be seeing in the future. I have no idea. I thought I knew what was going to happen, and then we had those two problems with the two banks, and now it's anybody's guess where we're headed economically.
Just ask a question. So speaking as a partner in a law firm.
Yes, I know.
We've had this debate for some time now about those who want to work from home and those who want to work in the office. I declare my hand, I'm much happier working at home. I have to be married to a lawyer who much prefers to work at home, and I'm happy in the office. However, the most important thing is for you touched on the Gen Z, I'm not quite sure what they are, but I call them millennials. And it's they're young, even younger than me. But the issue is this, is that if you are in a profession particularly, you cannot pick up in the way that you do if you're working collaboratively. We have a lot of young people in our office, and you're just listening, you're absorbing, you're just taking in around you what's happening. I was talking to one of our paralegals about it last week. Said, look, I'm here. I can just hear the way that you're dealing with, not just me, but my other colleagues, how you're dealing with the clients, how you meet with them. You cannot do that in a Zoom call, and it's impossible. But it's a dimension, because people really at times, at the height of the pandemic, I was at home. I didn't want to be at home, but I was at home. And my productivity was much higher in many ways. I was working much longer hours. I'd leave my computer on, I'd go and have dinner. I'd come back, my computer was still on, and I was still doing emails at 9 o'clock at night. I was completely bonkers, but that was happening. And I just wondered what, just that kind of scenario that I paint, and you've echoed it a bit, that is, and I just wondered whether there's, how you see it going forward. I mean, are we going to be stuck where new employers will take on new members of staff and say, I'll come and work for you, Gerald, I'm very happy to, can I have 1 day a week at home or 2 days a week at home? And at times you want to say no, you want to say, I want you in the office for at least 5 days a week, so you can get to meet people and know who the hell you are. And so anyway, I could go on a great level, but I mean, I'm getting on a great, but I'll just stop for now.
I always love listening to you. So I think this, no, but I do think this differs by occupation. A lot of the frontline occupations during the pandemic cannot be done at home. If you're a cashier in a supermarket, you cannot work from home. You're not going to ring people up from your kitchen table, right? It doesn't work. If you're working in a meat processing, poultry processing plant, agricultural work, none of that can be done at home. So there's a tremendous divide around the different sectors. And it's so easy because we're trained, you and I, in law. I'm an academic, you're practicing, a very academically oriented practitioner. We're very elite. There are many jobs. So at our university, we have people who take care of the facilities. They cannot work remotely, right? So the heating and cooling system goes out. You can't be in bed to fix it. You must be on the campus to fix it, right? And so I'm mindful that this is not a problem of all sectors. It is a problem of elite workers in elite sectors, technology, law, the academy. Medicine is interesting because some medicine can be performed remotely. Telehealth really took off. If you're a surgeon, there is robotic surgery, and yet I really think a lot of what doctors do has to be done with the patient in front of you. Maybe not all, and certainly diagnosis can be done very far away. If you're a pathologist and you're reviewing scans or results, you can be doing that half the world away. So technology makes a lot of things possible, and I think the key is that all generations, not just Gen Z, and I think Gen Z are the children who were born in 1996 and later. So I have one child who's a millennial, he's 1990, another who's Gen Z, who is 99, born in 99. I think most people who work in sectors where flexibility is a possibility, they want that flexibility. So what we're arriving at for some of our workers on campus, admin support. We're saying, at least for the summertime, we're going to do 3-2, 3 in the office and 2 at home, if you'd like, or early release on Friday afternoon at 1 p.m. for the summer months. And it's just to be more flexible and to give people the sense that if the job allows it, they can have a modicum of control over their work and home life. So I think that's what we do ideally. Ultimately, if you're a farm worker, agricultural worker, you must be in the field working with whatever it is you're growing.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one in the audience, anyway.
Follow up.
Bill, and then we'll allow you to.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a mischievous question and probably impossible to answer. But from a legal perspective, your positive story at the end about the role of community, is there a role the law can play in supporting that sort of community mutual support?
Yeah, there's always a role for law to play. Gerald may not like this comment that I'm going to make, but I'm going to make it anyway. I think society always evolves before the law does, and I think that's a good thing. So if you think of social movements like the civil rights movement in the United States, that happened for 2 decades, the protests, sitting in at lunch counters, people being thrown in prison for sitting at the front of a bus or in a train car because they were Black. It took a long time for the law to catch up. So the law has a role to play, but community always leads. I tell all of my students, your biggest impact will always be local community. You must always build community, and then the law follows. I do think that the law plays an important role. You look at it on the books, it has a symbolic effect. It does impact conduct, it does, but never, or usually not in the way that a legislator would assume. Law on the street functions very differently than law on the books and in the courts. You have to really do sociological research to understand how organizations deploy law in ways that may achieve the end goals that the legislature had in mind, or to divert or subvert those goals. You know, creative compliance. How can it make it look like I'm complying with the law, but really doing what I want to do anyway? The sociologists call that cosmetic compliance. But that doesn't mean law is not important. It's immensely important. And I wouldn't be in any other profession.
Okay, so
Mine was too similar to the last one. I was actually the same question in a different form, the same question.
lovely. Lovely questions.
No, can you just pull up my last slide, Christiana? Is that possible? Because I wanted to put up the last professional picture that was ever taken of Malcolm and me, just to take a look at it. And I want to give, because I didn't give photo credit, our photographer was Jill Sargeant. That was San Diego. Malcolm was feeling well and made a trip to the United States in April 2019. And Jill and Malcolm stayed at the house for a week. And that is the last professional picture taken of us by the photographer known as Jill Sargeant.
Very nice picture.
He's got a smile on his face.
Yeah, he is. Maybe not as big as mine, but he is. Yes.
You should accuse Malcolm of smiling.
So I just thought I'd put that up to end on
It's
a
a lovely
positive. No,
lovely.
thank you. Well, thank the photographer. He's fabulous.
Who is it?
Yes, I think she should.
Councillor.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, when I first heard that Middlesex University were going to do these lectures, I wanted David to do the first. And I always hoped that Stephen would come and do this, and this has been a dream. So thank you very much, everybody. This was very special. No, come here. Yes. She doesn't want to.
She's not going to speak, but
No.
can I just read a sentence out
Yeah.
on that? Because it really touched me and it resonates with what Susan was saying. It says, I aim to change the face of technology so that more women of colour feel that there's a place for them within the corporate world. And I actually think that is a wonderful ambition to have. And Malcolm would be absolutely so proud to be associated with that.
Thank you. Can we do a photograph? Let's have me on one side. And do you want to come up to David? David, do you want to come up?
Yeah, go David. Go David.
Do you want to pull it up?
Yes, I do. Let's do a lovely group photo. Make us look gorgeous.
I'll do Malcolm smile. Malcolm smile.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1.
On Gerald or Sarah, be careful.
Okay, this is good. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Awesome.
Next time you do so much webinar, so you're getting as well, being with us.
We can continue the conversation over some nibbles and things just outside.
Me?
Thank you, webinar.
For photographs. Thank you all. So just say a few words to Susan.